Accessing the western side of the Waverly Salmon River Long Lake Wilderness area, you will find the Crowbar hiking trail system. Now that's a hiking trail system that has over 16.5 kilometers of trails, and you will find some challenging routes that include unspoiled wilderness, lakes, rivers, and wetlands. And it's here that I'm on my walkabout today, taking on the Porters Lake and Spriggs Brook Trail. There are in fact 5 formal marked loops in the Crowbar Trail's hiking system. They take you to a variety of lakes, including, of course, Crowbar Lake, but also Barron Lake, Otter Lake, West Lake, and the largest on these trails, Granite Lake, which is where I'm headed today. All of the trails can be accessed from the main trailhead on Myra Road where I entered. There is a second trailhead at the end of River Road at Otter Lake, which provides closer access to trails at the other end of this network. Well, large rocks like this were left by Nova Scotia's glacial past. They're called erratics. These days they serve as guideposts along the trail system. And that's not all that different from what they were used for in the past. In fact, many trails in Nova Scotia follow routes that the Mi'kmaq would have used for hunting and guiding or traveling between communities. And they too used boulders like this or large piles of rocks as guideposts along the way. Large rocks such as this are honored as grandmother and grandfather rocks by the Mi'kmaq. Their associations can be traced to the legend of Glooskap's grandmother coming from stone. The grandmother and grandfather stones look out for travelers as they pass, helping them find their way. Indigenous people would often stop at the rocks and leave offerings like tobacco. Glooskap legend goes as follows. Glooskap saw an old woman sitting on a rock. Silver hair was shining and glittering. "I am your grandmother," she said. "I owe my existence from this rock on the ground. Early this morning, dew formed over this rock, and with the help of the life giver, the shadow giver, and Mother Earth, they gave me a life of an old woman, already wise and knowledgeable," she said. "I will teach you all there is to know about the animals, the birds, the plants, the trees, and the fish. Then you will be able to gain your life from there." This trail system has lots of little boardwalks and bridges, that sort of thing over wet and damp areas, but you still want to be careful because they can get worn over time and you don't want to be tripping. Well, at this point, you can go either left or right to get to Granite Lake. If you were only doing the Porters Lake Loop Trail, you could pick either direction. You'll come right back to here. That trail is 2.5 kilometers back to the trailhead. I'm taking the right side of the trail because that's a little bit shorter to Granite Lake. The Porters Lake Loop is, of course, named for Porters Lake, the very large lake which is across the Myra Road from the trailhead. Porters Lake is 19 kilometers long, but most of it isn't overly deep, averaging only 5 meters. It does max out at a very deep 30 meters in one spot, but the average depth, even up here at the northern end, is still only 12 meters. The lake empties out to the Atlantic Ocean, just to the east of Lawrencetown Beach, which makes the lake itself interesting. Up here at the north end, near the trailhead, the lake is entirely fresh water, but at the southern end, it's almost entirely salt water. One of the things that you see a lot of as you're hiking through here is granite. In fact, one of the deciding factors in protecting this land was that it is part of the Eastern Shore Granite Ridge, otherwise known as the Walkabout batholith. Now, that batholith has a ridge which stretches to a height of 400 feet in some places. The highest point is actually near North Preston, at a place called Target Hill. Granite is generally very easy to identify. It has a coarse texture and is made up of many different rock types. It can have many colors, as anyone who has shopped for a granite countertop will know. But in Nova Scotia, gray and pink crystals of potash feldspar mixed with quartz and mica are most common. That granite is the basis of why this area is important geologically. It's the second largest granite batholith in the province, the largest being South Mountain in the Annapolis Valley. Low-lying areas across this ridge fill with water forming lakes, which is why there are so many lakes in this wilderness. Of course, the geologic formation is much larger than the wilderness area itself. It runs from Waverley all the way to Sheet Harbor, a direct length of roughly 70 kilometers and a width of 20 kilometers. This area is also very old, formed in what is known as the Devonian period. That was a time between 420 and 360 million years ago. That was an important period of time in the Earth's history. It's when vascular plants started to spread, which resulted in forests. By the middle of that period, plants with true root systems were being formed. And also during that period, the first seed-bearing plants appeared. In the water, fish species began to diversify, resulting in that time also being known as the Age of the Fishes. Well, it was truly a time of change when these hills were formed. Now, of course, they're beautiful hiking trails and a wilderness area. I've made it almost 2 kilometers, which has taken me to the turning point of the Porters Lake Trail, and now I'm going to be joining the more formal part of the Spriggs Brook Trail and headed to Granite Lake. That's after the break.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
I'm hiking in the Waverley Salmon River Long Lake Wilderness area. I'm on the Spriggs Brook Trail on my way to Granite Lake. Now, these trails that go through here, they're wonderful, and they're primarily maintained by volunteers. The Crowbar Lake Trail System was developed by the Porters Lake and Myra Road Wilderness Area Association and is currently managed by a local community group, the Crowbar Lake Wilderness Association, through trail agreements with the province of Nova Scotia. If you are traveling with children, the Earth Adventures website includes exploration and fun activity ideas to complete while traveling this route. Well, this wilderness area that I'm hiking through is quite large. It's over 8,900 hectares. And the Crowbar Lake Trail System, this trail system, is one of the highlights, one of the reasons it was protected. The wilderness area is defined by ridges of red spruce, white pine, balsam fir, and hemlock. Some of the older trees in this wilderness even show evidence of having survived historic wildfires. This is one of the locations in Nova Scotia where, on the exposed granite hilltops, you can see jack pine. In the lower areas, you'll find boggy gullies defined by black spruce and balsam fir. Well, that's Granite Lake, and that's where I'm headed. Well, much of this wilderness area is not easily accessible by foot. It's this area that has the most widely maintained trail system. Beyond here, there are short hike opportunities and canoe and portage sites that you can find at Lake Major, along Aerotech Drive near the airport, and along the Salmon River Road. 1/3 of the Lake Major watershed, which supplies drinking water to Dartmouth and surrounding areas, is in this wilderness area. The watershed, of course, existed prior to the area being designated a wilderness area, and while the protection under a watershed and wilderness area are generally complementary, the provincial designation recognizes that Halifax Water will need to do work within the watershed to maintain drinking water quality. So in addition to the wilderness area, there is also a protected water area designation. And in that part of the wilderness, rules around things like fishing, swimming, and other land uses are a little different. That's no different than the fact that the use rules are a little different in the Waverley Game Sanctuary portion of the wilderness, which is found on the Miller Lake end of this vast area. You know, jack pines have a really interesting place in Canadian art history. One of the group of 7, Tom Thompson, painted a work called The Jack Pine sometime around 1916 or 1917. That painting depicts a lonely jack pine sitting on the shores of Ontario's Algonquin Park. Today, it hangs in the National Gallery of Canada. Now, the jack pines in Nova Scotia are especially interesting. Researchers from Quebec have come here to study the seeds of the trees. They have found that jack pines in Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Saskatchewan are all genetically distinct, with histories shaped by the same glaciers that have left those large boulders, the erratics. That means that lonely jack pine in Thompson's painting is only a very distant relative of the Nova Scotia jack pines, rather than an identical species, as was once thought. After the last ice age, the jack pines started to retreat southward. And what happened was the species began to become fragmented and change the distribution. So what you saw, say, a millennia ago is very different from what you see today. The jack pine is an interesting tree, even beyond its genetic diversity, as it's particularly adapted to replacing forest area impacted by fire. The cones of jack pines remain closed for years. In fact, often until a forest fire kills the mature tree, which then causes the cone to open, reseeding the ground. The reason for this is the cones found at the top of a mature tree require a temperature of over 50 degrees Celsius to open. The lowest cones on the tree may open at 27 degrees because of the additional heat reflected from the ground. For this reason, very few cones will open up without fire. In another temperature adaptation, the cones will also open when they get very cold, below -46 degrees Celsius. So this here is a pitcher plant. Now, if you had come through in the spring, there are these beautiful flowers that come off the top of them. They're often found in the wet areas of the forest. They're very, very pretty in the spring, but don't let their good looks deceive you. The pitcher plant flower is actually a set of curved leaves. The leaves have a sweet smell that attracts insects. Tiny hairs on the leaves make it difficult for the insects to get out of the pitcher once they've landed. Further down inside the funnel, the leaf becomes smooth like glass, preventing the insects from getting out. Rainwater sits at the bottom of the funnel, and as insects reach the water, the plant releases an acid and digests the insect in a very similar way to how humans digest food. This waterway brings water from Camp Lake in the north all the way to Granite Lake. You know, canoeing and paddling are popular pastimes in this wilderness area, though not so much down in this part of it, despite the fact that this river is absolutely beautiful and would probably make for a wonderful canoeing spot, and Granite Lake itself is quite large. There are no designated launch sites or even portage routes, so it's quite difficult to actually get a canoe or any kind of kayak or boat into that lake. More of the paddling is done up towards Otter Lake in the west, where there are not only designated portage routes and launch sites, but also a number of lakes and other water bodies that connect to one another.
Oh, come on, won't you be mine?
Well, this is Granite Lake and the destination for my hike today. These trails continue from here, and there's all sorts of different adventures you can take. Another time I'll come back and perhaps check out some of the other lakes and the trails that go around those. For now, I'm headed to the other side of the Waverly, Salmon River, Long Lake Wilderness area to visit a waterfall in the shadow of the airport.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
In the shadow of Halifax's Stanfield International Airport, at the end of Perrin Drive in the Miller Lake West subdivision, you will find that the paved road suddenly turns to dirt. Now, a 2.5 kilometer hike starting here will take you to the Johnson River Falls. Those falls are at the other side of the Waverly Salmon River Wilderness area from the Crowbar Trail where I was. And it's those falls that are my destination on today's Walkabout. You won't find a trailhead sign or marker here. The parking itself is really just a space at the end of the pavement. With a high clearance vehicle, you can go a little further along the road, but it really isn't too far before the turnoff towards the falls. Now, if you were to continue 2.5 kilometers just down this road, you would reach Resource Road and the Aerotech Business Park. But today, I'll only need to take in about 500 meters of this roadway. There are numerous little offshoot trails from this road as you come up, so if you're not familiar with the Johnson River Falls Trail, it is worth downloading one of the many free maps that are available just so you head off in the right direction. Now, where I'm turning onto is mainly a combination of different ATV tracks, and in wet weather they can get pretty muddy. This is a hike where the destination, the falls, is really what it's all about, more so than the trail itself. Now, the trail at times is indistinct, so you do have to watch where you're going, but it is also well worth watching for the different animals and plants that can be found along the route, ones which change with the seasons. Some distance to the right of me is Soldier Lake. There is a Nova Scotia Power access road you can hike down from Perrin Drive to see the lake. It's a popular destination in summer for fishing and in winter for skating. There is a dam at the lake which allows it to function as a reservoir for the power facility at Lower Miller Lake, something you can see at the intersection of Highways 102 and 118. Soldier Lake, in fact, has 2 earthen dams as part of the power system. In addition to the one on the Miller Lake side, which helps direct water through the spillway, there is one at the far end preventing water from flowing back to the Lake Major watershed. Water flows from Soldier Lake down through Miller's Falls and on to Miller Lake. The entire system is called the Fall River Hydro System, and it was built in 1985 and is fairly small in generation terms with a single 500 kilowatt powerhouse. So an interesting historical fact, if you will. The community of Fall River actually gets its name from a river that once flowed from Miller Lake down the hill towards Lake Thomas. There was a waterfall there, and in the 19th century, that waterfall actually provided power to mills in the area. In the 1950s, the highway was constructed and it completely obliterated that waterfall. The river, which still, I guess, technically exists, now runs in a pipe alongside the highway, which is where the power is generated. But Fall River really doesn't exist anymore as a river. The area I'm crossing now is undesignated Crown land. That designation surrounds much of this side of Perrin Drive and most of the land around Soldier Lake, right up to the falls. Along the trail, I will eventually cross a boundary marking what most refer to as a wildlife management area, though really it is a wildlife sanctuary under law. And then as I hit the falls itself, I will be on the edge of a protected wilderness area. Wildlife sanctuaries have an interesting history in Nova Scotia. In legislation, they are almost indistinguishable from wildlife management areas. In 1934, a government report said that sanctuaries are, quote, places where game of all kinds live their lives as nature intended, undisturbed except by their natural enemies, unquote. So of course, hunting and trapping are prohibited here. The area where I'm hiking at the moment at one time was heavily impacted by airport operations. Now the airport itself is only about 5 kilometers as the crow flies from here, and Johnson River pretty much flows right off the end of the runway. At least the headwaters there's some bogs, Juniper Lake, and so forth. Well, de-icing operations on the runway meant lots of toxic fluid would run off and into this river system all the way into Soldier Lake. A little over a decade ago, the airport installed a treatment system for that de-icing fluid, and the health has been improving here ever since. This area became a sanctuary because of a request in 1926 by the Canadian General Council of the Boy Scouts Association in Ottawa. It started at 1,200 hectares in size and has since grown to over 5,200. The Boy Scouts made the request because they did and still do operate a camp nearby on Miller Lake. This sanctuary now includes 3,400 hectares of woodland, 730 hectares of lakes and ponds, 360 hectares of wetland, and 580 hectares of barrens, and a small amount of built-up land, homes, and gas pipelines. You know, you can hear the sound of the river for quite a ways coming up the trail. As I come in through the trees, I'm standing on a ridge that's just sitting a little bit above Johnson River, and of course one of its waterfalls. I am also standing on the edge of the Waverley Salmon River Long Lake Wilderness area, and at places along here you can find the signs. This river flows down to Soldier Lake. Johnson River has a lot of rapids and a couple of waterfalls. As you look down, you can just see how fast that water flows. Author Caitlin Bowles once said, "There's always an adventure waiting in the woods." And that's certainly true here. Whether you're hiking an old ATV trail in search of a hidden waterfall, or you're crossing a wilderness area to see the lake that lies at the end, I hope you find that adventure on your next Walkabout.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.